All right, so we're going to cover the content for this lecture is in chapter 20, so we're going to get our way through blood vessel structure, the order or pattern of blood flow, some generalities, and then pulse points, and learning to take blood pressure will be handled in lab. God bless you. So the cardiovascular system is made up of the blood and the heart, which we already studied, and so this is vessel day, so blood vessels. It is a transportation system. It's going to carry blood and all of the constituents in blood to the tissues. So we're going to be delivering oxygen and nutrients to cells. The harder working that tissue, the more nutrients and oxygen it's going to need. Also, when cells go through cellular respiration, they make carbon dioxide and waste products, particularly acids. Those need to be removed and they need to be handled. And we went through the endocrine system, and we know that hormones are signaling molecules, and they too are going to be transported in the blood. Number one global killer is going to be cardiovascular disease. This is an old stat, so I wouldn't look at the number of deaths, but that has not changed. So far, that is our number one killer. Number two is cancer, and then we'll talk about respiratory diseases in Unit 3. So look, down here is the learning objective. Know organs and functions of the cardiovascular system. Because the cardiovascular system is this delivery system, and every cell is going to rely on that delivery of oxygen and nutrients, and every cell in your body is going to rely on getting their waste removed, a poor cardiovascular system is going to impact all the other systems. Okay, and that is exactly what this whole table is telling you. If there's inadequate blood flow going to any of the systems, that system is also going to suffer. So you do need to know blood flow. So we discussed the heart already, and so we talked about circuits. So the right side is a pulmonary circuit, and the left side of the heart is a systemic circuit. So now we're talking about the vessels. We learned that the vessels leaving the heart, so going away, another word for that is efferent or exiting vessels. Those are arteries. When they get smaller, they're called arterioles. And then the functional unit of the cardiovascular system are capillaries. So those are going to be the smallest of the blood vessels. And that's where that exchange is going to occur. So oxygen drop off, nutrient drop off, pickup of carbon dioxide, pickup of waste. And then it's time to head back to the heart. So these are all capillaries. So leaving the capillary beds, there's small veins. They're called venules. And then the smaller veins are going to merge and form larger veins. And then the veins are the ones that go towards the heart. Okay, so it was arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, veins, and we're going to look at the structure of each of these different types of vessels. So before we do that, this is a great sort of introductory video, and then we'll just talk about some basics when it's finished.
The vascular system is made up of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. This system can be thought of as a transportation or highway system. These roads provide unhindered flow of life-sustaining fluid and also rid waste from the body. Arteries, which always pump blood away from the heart, and veins, which always return blood to the heart, are similar in that they provide the roadways. Like roadways have different speed limits, weight limits, and traffic to deal with, the vascular system also has its own set of conditions to deal with. Arteries are like freeways offering fast, one-way traffic moving away from the heart. Arterioles act like off-ramps from the arteries to the capillary beds. Capillaries are like neighborhood roads. This is where the loading of nutrients to the cell and unloading of waste from the cell occurs. Venules act like on-ramps from the capillary beds to the veins. Veins are also like freeways, but since they contain 60% of the total blood volume, it's more like slow-moving heavy traffic leading back to the heart. Arteries and veins are each made up of 3 tunics, or coats. The outside layer, tunica externa, the inside layer, tunica intima, and the middle layer, tunica media. In this video, I will only talk about the tunica media. The tunica media is the middle layer of the blood vessel. It is the muscle layer that allows for the vessel to constrict. It also contains elastin, which allows the vessel to stretch and rebound like a rubber band. In the arteries, the tunica media is much thicker due to the forces generated by the heart. So when your blood pressure elevates in response to the demand of the body, the increase in pressure and volume can't be tolerated. Otherwise, the arteries will just pop like an overfilled water balloon. Because there's no pulsating forces in the vein, there's no need for as much elastin or muscle in them. Hence, the tunica media is much thinner in veins. More about arteries. Remember, arteries carry blood away, and both begin with the letter A. If you've ever felt a pulse, that is an artery. Only arteries pulsate. When you get your blood pressure checked, they are listening for the sound of the blood flowing through an artery. Because arteries are pressurized, if it is cut, a person could bleed out very quickly. Therefore, arteries need to be more protected and situated deeper in the body. When a blood vessel is cut, it is easy to tell if it was an artery or vein. Arteries will spurt pulsating blood, as compared to a vein where the blood just flows. Now moving on to veins. Veins are generally visible just below the skin. One reason for that is to regulate body temperature. Another special feature found in veins are valves. Proof that veins have valves can be seen in those people who have those nice large veins in their arms or hands. You can actually see the valve working by occluding the blood flow, then melting the blood out while keeping the vein occluded. Where the blood stops, that's where the valve is. Now when you let go of the occluded vessel, you will see blood return. One way to tell the difference between a vein and an artery is if you can see the blood vessel, it's most likely a vein. If you can feel the blood vessel pulsate, it's an artery. So what's the importance of having valves in your veins? Let's look at someone sleeping. The body's laying flat, blood flows back to the heart evenly, and you can see there's not much need for those valves. Now let's remove those valves, and you'll see the blood continues to flow. So why do we need these valves? First, let's look at a container of water laying flat, and if you stand it upright, the fluid will fall to the bottom due to gravity. The same thing would happen in the body if we didn't have these valves. Without those valves, blood will flow in the direction of gravity, meaning that when you stand upright, the blood will all pool in your lower legs. Not only would that make it harder to walk, but there's a bigger issue. Now that the fluid has drained from the veins will collapse on themselves, meaning no blood is returning to the heart, and without blood flow, the heart can't beat. In fact, all organs rely on continuous blood flow. Without that continuous blood flow, death follows. Now that we know why we need these valves, let's put them back and bring life back. In closing, the vascular system is just a transportation network of tunnels throughout the body.
So that's a good one to rewatch again after our discussion today. But just some basics we got there. So arteries, because they are under pressure, they are generally deep. There are places where they are superficial, and those are going to be our pulse points. For every artery, there is generally 2 veins, so we have more veins than you have arteries. Veins are going to be positioned adjacent to arteries, so the pulsing is going to help return blood, and I'll explain that later. The size, so it's anatomy class, right? So we're going to just talk about arteries, and they become arterioles, and then capillaries, and venules, and veins. All of these, they're going to be gradually changing size. Okay, so we're going to go from larger to smallest, the capillaries, and then they go from smaller to larger as we return to the heart. Structure of the vessels suits their function and the amount of pressure that they are placed under. And 2, vasculature, so when we go to lab and on your lab list, we're going to learn some major arteries and veins, but the vasculature in humans varies, especially in the venous system. Arteries and veins have the same 3 layers, and the old-timey word for layer is tunic, because a tunic was a coat. I shall go don my tunic, I'm going outside, so it just means coat. The inner layer is the tunica intima, so think internal, or it's intimate with the blood. It is, like all of our linings, it's going to be epithelial tissue. It's going to be simple squamous. Remember, those are the flat cells that look like tiles if you were to see them on the top. And so our linings. When you have epithelial tissue lining an inside chamber, it's called endothelium. It is going to be sitting on a basement membrane. And notice in this picture, you see this little blue line. They usually draw elastic tissues as blue because when you stain tissues, the stain is absorbed, the blue stain is absorbed more by elastic tissues. So basement membranes are like a wall between two cities, so built between epithelial tissue, connective tissue, and so that's going to have that lining anchored to our next layer. This inner lining, so the endothelial layer, the tunica intima, is going to be continuous with the endocardium. Okay, so cells grow in sheets, and so the lining, it's going to be the same type of smooth lining that's going to allow for blood flow. Healthy endothelium is going to secrete anticoagulants, so against blood clotting, okay, and that we don't want any intravascular clotting. So prostacyclin, nitric oxide, these are things that are secreted by healthy endothelium. And we'll talk about atherosclerosis, and the buildup of plaque prevents that secretion of those anticoagulants. M for media, think middle and think muscle. So we have the tunica intima, and then that middle layer in both arteries and veins is the tunica media. So this is smooth muscle. We're looking at tubes, right? So if that muscle contracts, it gets smaller. So this is the layer that's going to cause vasoconstriction. So the diameter is going to get smaller, or vasodilation, meaning the diameter of that vessel gets larger. And we can have that both when you hear the word vasoconstriction, vasodilation, we're referring to arteries. If we're specifically talking about veins, then it's venoconstriction and venodilation. The nerves that control this constriction and dilation is going to be underneath the autonomic nervous system. They're going to be almost all sympathetic fibers. This outer layer is called tunica externa. It is an old-timey name for its adventitia. It is a connective tissue layer that is going to anchor that vessel in place. It's going to attach it to the adjacent structures. And the structure of it is going to depend, once again, if it's an artery or a vein. Is this vessel under lots of pressure or a little pressure? If it's under a lot of pressure, it's going to have more elastic fibers. Some of the larger vessels, so leaving the heart and going right towards the heart, they're so large, the wall is so thick that they need their own blood supply. And that's where you're going to see in this tunica externa, that's where you see what's called the vasa vasorum, or the vessel of the vessels. So small blood vessels that are feeding the wall of that large artery or that large vein. And so this is the aorta, and the aorta is roughly the size of a garden hose, and it has a very thick wall. And so you can see the tunica intima, you see the tunica media, it's a very meaty or muscly vessel, it's under the most pressure, and then that tunica externa, you can see these are little blood vessels that are feeding this tissue, the wall of the vessel. When you look at vessels in cross-section, like I say, usually arteries and veins are next to one another. The arteries, because they're under more pressure, have thicker walls. The veins have thinner walls. The arteries are going to have this open space is called the lumen. Notice the size of the lumen, this is where the blood would be, is smaller than the lumen of a vein. Because veins have thinner walls, they are collapsible, and we're actually going to use this property, this collapsing, this thin wall, to sort of milk and help our blood return to the heart because the venous system is under very low pressure. All right, so looking at this picture, one is an artery, one is a vein. So is number one an artery or a vein? It's an artery, right? How'd you know that? Thicker, round, yes. Because they have the muscle, when they're in cross-section, they hold their shape. So yeah, so you can easily tell the difference between an artery and a vein. And you can, with some imagination, you can definitely see the three tunics on the artery much easier. So the tunica intima is that inner endothelium. Here you have the tunica media, and then you have the tunica externa. Over here, the vein, you can see the tunica intima, really thin muscle wall, so thin tunica media, and then its largest layer is going to be that outer layer, the tunica externa. This difference in structure is because of difference in function and the amount of pressure. This is showing you, so from the heart, we're going to talk about blood pressure today, and remember the heart contracts and blood is ejected from the ventricle. So that's called systolic pressure. So that's the greatest pressure, so that's the top. And then when the heart relaxes, there's still pressure, blood is still moving even when the heart's at rest in diastole, and that would be the lower pressure. So close to the heart, there is a difference in the systolic pressure and the diastolic pressure. Because the arteries, so we have the aorta, and then elastic's going to branch, we'll have elastic arteries and muscular arteries, and you can see that the arteries are under the effects of this blood pressure. So they have to have a thick wall, and they have to have some elastic fibers to withstand this pressure. Then we're going to get cute little branching, and we'll get little arteries, which are called arterioles. And notice we have this big drop in pressure. And then we have our capillary beds, which is the functional unit of the cardiovascular system, exchange. And now we're trying to go back to the heart. So venules, we have very little pressure now, or like at 10 millimeters of mercury, medium and large veins, and we're almost to nothing by the time we get to the vena cava. So remember, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava go into that right atrium. So the veins, to make sure our blood actually returns, they have some adaptations. They're going to have that thinner collapsible wall, and then we just watched that video. They also have valves to prevent backflow. We'll talk about the skeletal and respiratory pump when we get to veins. All right, so I gave it to you this way in your notes, and so we're going to talk through the difference between arteries, arterioles, capillaries, veins, and venules. And then I have this picture as well. So we just discussed the 3 tunics, right? And then these were the key things about the 3 tunics. And now we're going to start from the heart, so the systemic circuit coming from that left side, that left ventricle, and we are just going to follow our way around the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And then next week we'll talk about the lymphatic system. So in case you're wondering what these green things are, it's representing the lymphatic system.